Okay, so today we are going to talk about consensual exchange just in the abstract. I have this video series where I say consensual exchange doesn't guarantee fairness. And I think I need to unpack that a little bit because I think consensual exchange is required for fairness, just that it doesn't guarantee it. Right? When you look at, if you think about exchange of like goods and services and you think about structures where it's not consensual, it's pretty easy to see why they start being problematic. Like slavery is obviously problematic, although there's a Greek philosopher who argues that it is consensual in what I now think is like a really stupid caricature. But I think it was Aristotle, not 100% sure. But he argues that slaves deserve to be slaves because they have a slavish mentality. And if they didn't have a slavish mentality, they would kill themselves to escape slavery. So he says, you have a choice. You're consenting to this whole deal. I often think about this in specific example or in the context of people who basically only have like one work opportunity because they have no sort of leverage to negotiate for better prices, and they say either you could work for me or not, and well, if it's either work or starve to death, you pretty much have to accept the deal, whatever it is, right? And so it's obviously not as extreme as Aristotle's example, but at a certain point, if you don't have any options, then you don't have any leverage. Getting a little off the beaten path here, though, slavery is obviously, you are not allowed to, if you are a slave, what you are not allowed to do is you are not allowed to say, hey, I'm getting a raw deal here. I'm going to go down the street and see if I can work in Billy's field for like $5 more or whatever. First of all, you're not getting paid. You're not agreeing to it to begin with, but you also just can't go and try and get a better deal. Right, you are locked into your bad deal, which was also the case with sharecropping, which functionally replaced slavery for a bit in the United States. And anytime there's not a consensual exchange, what the end thing is that it's reliant on this sort of threat of violence. And anytime someone is using a threat of violence to coerce behavior, there's obviously going to be something unfair. So when consensual or when exchange is forced, often it is the case that both parties do not benefit from the exchange. When it is not forced, it's almost guaranteed that both parties benefit. Let's unpack that a little bit. So in the United States, there's this government sort of intervention known as eminent domain, where if they are trying to put up a public works project, they can force you to sell your property. They can force you to sell your house if they need the land in order to do something. Okay, if you value your house at, let's say, $100,000, and the government says, we're going to pay you $70,000. There's nothing you can do about it. You have to sell it for $70,000. You lose $30,000 of value, right? You experience a decrease in value. This can only happen if you are forced to make an exchange. Consensual exchange means that if you don't value whatever you're trading for more than what you're trading, you'll just never make the trade. And so what it does is it guarantees that both parties, from their perspective at the time, gain value. So an example of how you can gain value but like maybe regret it later is if you are dying of thirst in the desert. And let's say you're a millionaire, you have $2 million, and someone offers you a bottle of water for $1 million. You take that trade, even though a bottle of water is not necessarily worth $1 million to you in the abstract. It's worth $1 million at the time, and so you'll just take that trade. There's an increase in value there, but it is the person who's selling you the bottle of water is probably getting more value, right? Which is kind of where the caveat with a lot of the videos I'm making is that just because you're experiencing an increase in value doesn't mean that it's what's going on is really fair. So, for example, let's talk about the ideal situation. Let's say I sell aquariums, and I make an aquarium, and it's worth $100 to me. The amount of labor I have to put into it, it's like $100. Okay, someone wants to buy an aquarium, and they value that aquarium at $200. If I sell the aquarium to them for $150, they gain $50 of value because they gave me $150. They value it at $200. They increased their value. I gain $50 because I valued the aquarium at $100. I got $150. There we go. In an ideal world where you sort of have perfect competition, which is an economic state where everything like kind of reaches equilibriums. It's a fictitious economic state because there's no such thing as perfect competition. But if you have that, this is kind of the outcome you would sort of expect, is that people are splitting the value of things, right, in a equitable way. So when I say consensual exchange doesn't guarantee fairness, I'm saying it doesn't guarantee this sort of exchange where there's $100 of extra value gained total by the exchange, and both me and my partner just split it evenly. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fair. What often happens, I think, would be the case of, let's say I'm the only aquarium seller in town, and this guy can't go to anyone else for an aquarium. I can charge him $195 for the aquarium. We will both gain value from that exchange. He values it at $200. He'll gladly buy it at $195, and he'll gain $5 of value. But I will have gained $95 of value. I don't think that this is fair, even though both parties benefit. And I think it is particularly the case that this occurs with labor. So let's think of it not as an aquarium. You can reframe it a little bit like this. Let's say there's an aquarium factory. Okay. And I build aquariums, and I cannot go. There's no other aquarium factory in town, so I have to work for this aquarium factory, and they value my labor at, let's say, $10 an hour, and I value my labor at $6 an hour. I think that it'll usually be the case that the wage that is paid to the laborer will be closer to the 6 than the 10. So when the split happens, I value my labor at 6, let's say. I'll work for $6.50. They offer me $6.50. I don't have the leverage to get closer to 8, which would be splitting the value evenly. So this is sort of what I mean when I'm talking about how consensual exchange, even though it's producing value for both parties, it's asymmetric. And if the general thrust of my arguments is that if you are in the lower rungs of your ability to negotiate for better pricing on housing, or like the ability to sell your labor, so specifically unskilled laborers, then you will get really pushed down towards the bottom of what you're willing to accept, as a consequence of you just not having an ability to negotiate. Because there's a lot of people who are just unskilled laborers. And if you won't work for the low price, someone else will. Okay. Getting a little off the beaten path of talking about consensual exchange. But I think a couple other examples are worth mentioning. And these examples come from China, where... So in communism, China's not really a communism now. But it was, and the transitionary period is kind of interesting. In communism, you are not allowed to trade your goods for whatever price you want. So, while you can consensually exchange items, they have to be done at a price that is artificial and is not just like this consensual type of price. So, a good example of this is there used to be sort of quotas for like the first 100,000 items or whatever, where it had to be sold at a price ceiling. So this artificially low price, and then once a certain amount were sold, then they could be sold at market value. This was in China while they were transitioning to a market economy. What ended up happening is corrupt officials, let's say the item's umbrellas, would buy 100,000 umbrellas at the low price and then sell them at the market price. And so the people selling the umbrellas were all getting shafted because let's say they were still willing to sell the umbrellas. They could have found someone who was willing to pay more for them, and they would have gotten a bigger share of the profits, but instead the profits are going to the corrupt officials and the middlemen, right? So if you had a system where they could trade more freely, then, you would be able to, they'd be able to get more value. This also happened in China during this transitionary period where there were people with like two different statuses in regards to home ownership. If you lived in a rural area, and you were selling rural land to the city, you had to sell it at a certain price. If you were living in the city and you were selling city land to another city person, you could sell at market price. So what happened as these cities gobbled up rural areas is these rural people, I believe they were forced to sell as well, which is like even worse. They had to sell at this low price, and they sold to like a city developer person who would just turn around and sell it for 10x at the market value of the thing. And so you get obviously this is perverse, because the rural person has to sell this home for less than they probably value it at, and way less than what the market will value it at. And the reason it is perverse is because there's some sort of intervention that is forcing this to happen. Now, we're coming to a head a little bit. The thing is when you have a free market, you will have exchange will be as consensual as possible, so you won't have this artificial thing causing unfairness. In particular, like eminent domain, where you are losing value when you are forced to make the exchange. Or this example in China where you are forced to sell your home to the city who's just going to turn around, or the city guy who's just going to turn around and sell it for way more. Because he has a special status that you don't have. This is the problem, and I'm not exactly sure how to solve it, is when you have a free market, you sort of, and people can exchange stuff consensually, you guarantee an increase in value. But what ends up happening is the people who have a lot of money will generally begin to occupy positions where they have way more leverage, and they can make it so that they get 95% of the value when an exchange occurs. I'm not entirely sure, from a bigger picture perspective, how you solve this sort of thing, because if you institute market controls like price ceilings and price floors, that creates a different sort of unfairness. Like let's say you are trying to crack down on homeowners and you create this price ceiling. They can't charge anything more than that, and the goal is to make it so that the people who are renting from the landlords are getting a more equitable share of the value that is gained when the landlord leases and the other person rents from them. Okay. It makes sense, but you can also create a situation where the landlord just values their rental out at a certain rate that they can't charge. The price ceiling is below that rate. So suddenly now they can't make an exchange. They have a rental that they want to rent out. They can't rent it out for the absolute lowest price they'd be willing to rent out for. And so They just like let it sit. And so this is problematic in my mind. Also, like, what price ceilings do is if the price ceiling is like based on some sort of like square footage, for example, for rentals, what it'll do is it'll have the market effect of discouraging people from improving the properties, because if they improve it, they still can't charge more for it. So it kind of lowers the value of the property, and also it creates a shortage of goods, because there's normally what would happen is you would have an increase in price until you reach an equilibrium, and then you would have, roughly this amount you need for the amount of people who want it at a price that those people are willing to pay. So I think that, it's perhaps I come off as a little facetious in some of these videos where I'm talking about how like one person's fleecing another, where it's like I'm advocating some sort of top-down government price control. It's like it's more complicated than that, but I think it is naive to think that just because everyone is agreeing to the trade, that the trade is somehow guaranteed to be fair, which it's not. And I think I already mentioned it, but I think this is particularly the case with labor. I think I talked about aquarium factories. Where the people who are hiring, if they are hiring people who are unskilled, generally can charge the very lowest possible. And so what the question is how do you increase people's leverage to negotiate prices when they are kind of at the bottom of the barrel type of thing? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that, like, price ceilings necessarily, I think that they have kind of bad outcomes. And so you don't want to tack it at the price level, but you want to somehow increase people's leverage to either reject bad deals in terms of labor or pricing or that sort of thing. And I don't know exactly how you do that in a way that sort of generally promotes the most fairness. And these are mostly my pro free trade thoughts on this sort of thing, because a lot of the other ones I'm making are about ripping on consensual exchange, just not being sufficient to guarantee fairness. And the reason why is just the kind of the structure of how labor, or just how capitalism works. So capitalism, some person owns the company. This is really an oversimplification, but some person owns the company, and they don't have any incentive to own the company and do the things unless they make money by virtue of owning the company. So the person who owns the capital has to make money. Okay? Obviously, the people doing the labor have to make money. This is how this works. And the question is like, how do you make the value split one that looks fair? I think in an ideal world, like super ideal, impossible ideal, everyone would get paid the exact value of their labor. Unfortunately, if you do this, you can't have capitalism because there's no incentives for people to inject capital into projects. And so you have to split the value with the people owning the capital. And it's, how do you split the value the most fairly? And the problem is the people who have the resources generally have more leverage than the people offering up the labor. And you can't, I don't think there's a solution outside of capitalism, but like there's this very obvious thing where you're not getting the absolute value of your labor whenever you work, because you have to give some of the excess value to your, like, let's say when I work as an aquarium assembler, I produce $20 of value. Okay? The capitalist can never pay me $20 of value. Otherwise, the company just goes under. They can never pay me exactly what it's worth, and I would not expect them to. Let's say I just need $10 to survive. If there's a ton of people out there, who can do the same job as I can, they can just offer lower and lower prices until someone accepts, or as long as someone's accepting. So what will happen is if there's a ton of people who can assemble aquariums, they'll probably get paid around $10, a little bit more than $10. If there aren't a lot of people who can do that, then they can suddenly negotiate much higher prices for their labor. So let's say like something like doctors, where it takes a decade of school in order to do it. If there aren't a lot of people who can assemble aquariums, they might be able to get $19, for their labor. What seems fair, in the sense that you are taking both systems into account, would be like $15. Right? Because you have to pay people the minimum to survive. And if you can't pay them, then that shouldn't be a job. If you can't pay them that. And if people are unwilling to accept whatever price you're willing to pay, if like no person's willing to accept $20 to do your job, it also can't be a job. And so there's a lower limit and an upper limit for the like price of any labor. And the lower limit is the bare minimum to survive, and the upper limit is the true value of that labor. And you can't go outside of those. But somewhere in there, that's where the exchange occurs. And how do you try and make sure that, the split in there is kind of the most fair? And I'm uncertain how you give people who are in jobs that they don't have a lot of negotiation leverage. I don't know how you give them more leverage. Anyways, I think I've started rambling a bit towards the end. These are just some thoughts on, or wanting to importantly emphasize that I think consensual exchange, even though I'm ripping on it in some of these videos, is very much necessary for fairness. It just doesn't guarantee it, right? There's a difference between a necessary condition and a sufficient condition. And I think that a lot of times, what communicators sort of put out that annoys me is they say, you agreed to it and I agreed to it, so what's the problem? There's no problem here. And I just think that that's a rather superficial sort of analysis that fails to take into account that, there's some sort of abstract notion of the true value of labor. And that value isn't the one that gets paid. The value that gets paid is based on negotiation leverages and not the true value of the labor, which I think exists somewhere in the abstract, but is impossible to, practically speaking, is impossible to nail down precisely what the value of labor is. Anyways, hopefully this was interesting. If anyone has a particular juicy example of non-consensual exchange, like eminent domain, I think eminent domain is like a really good example where you like sometimes have to sell your house for less than you think it's worth. But if anyone has any examples of that sort, I'd love to hear them. If you YouTube algo stuff, like, comment, subscribe. I'm getting like so lazy at putting the end of my videos. It's like this weird, it's this weird sort of thing where, you think you should say it. It feels like very cliche to be saying it. And then, but like you have this confidence that it sort of works. People liking, commenting, and subscribe really juice the hell out of your algo. And so like it actually is tremendously useful in terms of like expanding your reach. But it's like this very, artificially YouTube-y thing to say. It like doesn't feel very personal. It's like depersonalizing to you, the viewer. It's like, it's treating you like some sort of like algo clicking machine. Like I want you to just like click the comments box and like type this is a comment, yay. And it's yeah, I don't know, maybe I should make a video on this, but it's like it just feels very artificial. Like maybe I should just stop doing it, but then like I like my algo getting juiced. I don't know. Anyways, have a good day.